It actually is in a broader sense about how do we end this catastrophe. And what effectively, it's not just President Biden, by the way. This is a bipartisan effort by what I call the uniparty, because he's got support from Republicans and Democrats in great numbers to keep this destructive and pointless proxy war against Russia going as long as possible. Now, he's ultimately interested, or at least his supporters are, or his managers or handlers, whatever you want to call it, to keep this thing going in perpetuity. I mean, this is a cash cow, sadly, for a lot of the wrong people in Washington. A friend of mine pointed out to me the other day, he said, Doug, have you taken a ride around Washington, D.C., drive through Potomac, Maryland, and then over to Great Falls and McLean and so forth, and see the enormous estates, mansions, whatever you want to call them, that have sprung up in these areas, largely as a consequence of this unending series of interventions and wars. These are people that have operated within the broader framework of the military-industrial congressional complex, and they've stuffed huge quantities of cash into their pockets. Ukraine promises to keep a lot of that going, although just as an aside, in case for some reason the cash cow called Ukraine stops producing, we've always got China and the imminent threat to Taiwan, which of course is nonsense. So these things are all part and parcel of the same thing. How do we sustain this $28 billion here, $30 billion there, that pays people very, very well inside the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and the defense industries and so forth, that justifies lots of pointless headquarters and 4-stars and so on. First of all, it doesn't matter what he does, because you can undo executive arrangements overnight. You know, this is not a treaty that was approved by the Senate that then becomes law. Whatever he thinks he's doing when he signs something as an executive agreement, those things can be overturned in 24 hours with a new president. So I don't see that as ominous as others would see it. I think it gets to this issue of Washington doesn't want to end this conflict, which is very foolish and very dangerous. So then the next question is, how does it end? Well, I think it ends in 3 ways. First of all, the Russians, who have been very deliberate and very cautious about moving forward against the Ukrainians, in the hopes that someone with common sense would come forward and negotiate an end to this, finally conclude, well, that's hopeless. They press all the way to the Dnieper River. They press right into Kiev, and they cross the river in the south and take Odessa, because they see no alternative. And even then, if there's no willingness to come to some sort of arrangement, well, then they call up another 400,000 or 500,000 troops, and they go all the way to the Polish and Romanian borders. So that's one way this could end. The second way that it ends is a financial economic crisis. We have it's interesting to watch the news this morning, and the usual suspects on the various cable news networks are saying, oh, what a great week in the stock market. Well, I'm sure it was a very good week, but what they don't bother telling anybody is that we are as close to the kind of 29 disaster as we have ever been in our history. And all of a sudden, all these great gains in the so-called stock market be wiped out in the space of a few minutes. Now, why? Everyone will come forward with a different theory. But the bond yields are up. The prices are down. And at some point, massive numbers of banks, both inside the United States and around the world, are going to look at all these treasury bonds that they invested in 20 years ago, when the interest rates were very, very low, and discover that, gosh, they're worthless. How do I get rid of these damn things? And when that happens, you're going to have a fire sale like nobody's ever seen, and that will produce an implosion in the financial system. Now, some people will step forward and say, well, look, this happened to the British not long ago, I guess in the spring and March. And the Bank of England said, no, we'll buy up whatever is necessary. And they managed to get past the crisis. Well, the same conditions that applied to Great Britain a few months ago still apply there, and they apply here. And you're not going to be able to get past it. And we cannot simply buy up all these bonds. It's just not possible. Now, you add to this the toxic debt that is already on the Fed's spreadsheets. and balance, and then go even further. Look at the banks around the country. The Silicon Valley Bank was just the beginning. We've had more banks fail. We continue to hear that more banks are failing. At some point, all of it fails. Now, then you ask someone like Nassim Taleb, this is the gentleman that invented the concept of the black swan. When does it all happen? And he'll look at you and he said, well, Armageddon is in view, but I can't tell you when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I can't either, but it's very definitely there. And you have also these other exogenous forces, things beyond the United States, like the Ukraine war. What happens in Ukraine doesn't seem to matter very much to most Americans. But let me tell you something. If the Russians press ahead and crush everything and then start moving west, that will have a big impact in Europe, and that impact will be felt here. And the Europeans are ultimately more fragile in the economic and financial sense, as you know, than we are. Germany and France really are the most important states in Europe. Germany is already in a deep recession, and there's no easy way out of it. They've been on a path of national suicide now from the moment they decided to join this anti-Russian proxy war. I don't see an easy way for them to get out. France is obvious. France is a seething, boiling pot of anger and hostility because millions of non-Europeans have flooded into that country and threatened the very existence of France, not just French national identity, French history and culture, but France, the nation state itself. The rest of Europe is watching. And you know what they always say about Paris? When Paris coughs, the rest of Europe gets a cold. And I think you're going to see something very much like that occur. So to briefly sum up, that's another way the war ends. Everybody just goes broke overnight, cuts their losses, and gets out. And the Europeans are already pulling back. We are not, because frankly, $28 billion is decimal dust to us. When you have a $34 trillion debt and you're almost up to 120% debt to GDP ratio, what difference does another 28 billion make? And that's where we are. So that's one way. And then there's another way. And this is one that everybody wants, but no one can find evidence for it. And that is that if someone steps forward, either leading Europe or even here in the United States, and says, we want an off-ramp, we want to end this. Well, I don't see that happening in Washington. So the only other way this happens is if the Europeans break away from us. And of course, that would mean fundamentally the end of NATO. You've already got the EU on life support. Everybody hates the EU. You can find different reasons in every country. The Germans don't like it because they're tired of being the cash cow for Europe. But everybody else in Europe likes to blame the Germans for all of their problems. So it's a bizarre set of circumstances, but everybody's fed up with the EU. And this is why no one in Washington, and certainly none of the current governments in Europe, are willing to step forward and make peace, because to do so is an existential threat to them. They are at war with the Russian state and the Russian people. The rest of us are not. They're at war because they've decided that Russia, this last nation state left in Europe that won't open its borders to millions of non-Europeans and non-Christians. They do have 20-25% Muslims, but those Muslims are overwhelmingly very content to live in Russia. And by the way, that's not new. In 1915, the Turks thought they were going to launch an Islamist crusade and liberate all the Muslims from Tsarist Russia. They crossed the Caucasus and found no one was interested in being liberated, because the people were quite content to live under the Tsar. We have a similar situation today in Moscow. But the point is that Russia is not going to knuckle under. It's not going to bow down to our financial hegemony. It's not going to tolerate our military hegemony. It's not going to accommodate our political dominance. So the only way this ends, in the third sense, is for the Europeans to step forward and say enough's enough. And of course, that's something we don't want. But frankly, I think we're doing everything in our power to make that happen.
Yeah. Mutual friend between us, Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, he had mentioned in an interview with me that as he drives around Washington, D.C., it's just these McMansions going up everywhere. And as you dig in and research, they're almost all connected to the military-industrial complex. So he says, on the one hand, they're flying the Ukrainian flag. On the other hand, if that war stops, they can't pay their mortgage. So like they have more incentive to keep this thing going. The other thing that stood out to me in the last week was I had Ray McGovern on, and he said, whether it's true or not, Russia has to be America's boogeyman, or you can't justify an $800 billion military budget. What are your thoughts on Mr. McGovern's comment?
Well, Ray's a great person and he makes great points, but he's wrong.
Okay.
You eliminate Russia from the equation and you have China.
Okay, well, they just get a new boogeyman.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And, all the time people say, oh, you just don't understand China. And I always say, how many times have you been to Northeast Asia? How many people do you know in the region? What's your knowledge of Chinese history, culture, and civilization? The Chinese are probably the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. Where is the evidence for all of the sinister motives and designs that you're imputing to them? I don't see it. If you look carefully at China today, it's pretty much where it was in the beginning of the 20th century. It's expanded to the limits of its capabilities. It can't expand any further. They've got 1.4 billion people. Every morning, Xi does not wake up and think of ways to attack America. Xi wakes up every morning thinking of ways to hold China together. I don't think people understand that. And they want to blame the Chinese for fentanyl. Well, the Chinese are making it and selling it. And in many cases, it's Chinese organized crime. And in a nation of 1.4 billion that has a long, long history of criminality and what I would call black market operations, it's pretty tough to crack down on all of that and hold it together. But in the case of China right now, stuff is coming into the United States via the drug cartels that operate out of Mexico and the Caribbean Basin. Those are your problem, not China. So you shut down the border, secure the border, and restore the rule of law inside the United States. Stop this nonsense of releasing criminals and slapping people on the hands who probably should be executed, frankly, and instead install a government that protects the people. Remember, government has to do three things. It has to protect the population, has to shelter the population, has to feed the population. Xi is doing that. Putin is doing that. Our government is not doing that. It's not protecting us in the least. All you have to do is open the newspapers, watch cable television. You'll get a fraction of what's actually happening. But the criminality in our country is epidemic. I mean, you go to a gas station in Philadelphia, you're lucky you're not being shot on the spot. You try to shop, you can't. The place is being looted. All the major stores are leaving. Look at San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia. It's terrible, but no one wants you to look at that. It's almost though, don't pay any attention to that. Look at the threat from Russia. Look at the threat from China. But the truth is, Ukraine is of no strategic vital interest to us, never has been. And the regime sitting in Kiev is hardly the paragon of liberal democracy. It's the opposite. It's worse than that. It's almost Stalinist at this point, and it's an organized crime state. It was when the war began. So this is all nonsense. But, Max is correct. People are profiting enormously from it, and they don't think it harms them. But then there's this other possibility, and that is that we're dumb. We do stupid things, and we try to intervene in Western Ukraine at the last minute to try and rescue our credibility, which is already in the gutter anyway with most of the world. And we bring on a major war with the Russians. What we don't understand right now is that we have threatened and bullied the Chinese for years to the point where the Chinese have convinced themselves they've got to prepare to defend themselves against us and our attacks. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to join with the Russians. So now you're in a war that involves not simply the Russian state and its armed forces, which are, by the way, better and more capable than China's, but nevertheless, you've got Chinese scientific industrial power and manpower linked to Russia. And what about the rest of the world? All you have to do is look at BRICS. Look at the recent acquisitions of BRICS. Saudi Arabia, whose importance to us cannot be overstated when it comes to the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia has just announced, we're joining BRICS. They plan to join this new gold-backed currency. What's happening to our financial hegemony? It's being eroded away as we sit here and talk. The world is going to de-dollarize. It's not going to happen overnight. It won't happen in 6 months. It'll happen in a year and 2 years and 3 years. But the handwriting's on the wall. Why? Everyone is sick of us.